Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to week 7 of our weekly NSP webinars. Thank you very much for taking the time to join us today, and we look forward to an engagement with you for this particular session. This particular session is going to focus on the establishment of the National Council on Gender-Based Violence and Femicide. I just wanted to give you a brief of why these webinars have been quite important. This is week 7, and we have had 6 webinars before, and this is all to help us have a deeper understanding of our NSP on GBV, develop a shared understanding of what we need to do as civil society in order to realize the aspirations of what is contained in the NSP. The NSP on GBV, for those that haven't been able to take a look at it or haven't engaged with it, is a framework in itself that is there to connect the various sectors of society within a coherent plan to respond to gender-based violence. We all know that we have a high level of gender-based violence that we've been experiencing in South Africa for the past couple of years. And despite civil society's best efforts, the response that we've had, that government has had to gender-based violence has not been as strong as we would like it to be. And the NSP is essentially a plan that enables, with a guide that will enable us to respond to GBV so that we can be able to eliminate this scourge. And so these webinars are to help us understand the NSP so that we can take steps to ensure its effective implementation. Apologies, I just realized that I actually didn't introduce myself to begin with. My name is Rumbi Elizabeth Chidori, and I am with the Foundation for Human Rights. And once again, welcome to you all. Also, just to give you a brief of how the presentation is going to go, we are going to have a presentation, and our presenter this week is Professor Rashida Manjoo, who is a fellow activist and feminist who has had decades of experience in social justice and human rights work. Rashida is also the former UN Special Rapporteur on Violence Against Women, and she served the years from 2009 to 2015. She has also served as an advocate for the High Court and is also a former Parliamentary Commissioner of the CGE, which is the Commission for Gender Equality. She has been involved in training judges and lawyers on human rights, and she is also an author as well. I am just going to introduce her, and Professor, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Rumbi, and thank you very much to the technical team that's assisting. I'm technologically challenged, so Kay is going to help with the slides. But thank you to everyone who is listening. Thank you very much to the Call to Action Collective for putting together this wonderful webinar series. I do think one of the mistakes that we sometimes make is to come up with new laws and policies and programs, and we do not do the educative work, which is so necessary for moving forward, for effective implementation, etc. So thank you to the organizers of this webinar series. And thank you also to them for inviting me, which forced me to have a haircut and get out of my sweats, like most of us are doing. I want to make a point up front that next week we have Nsiki, who's going to be covering what the NSP actually says in terms of setting up a council. She's also going to be looking at some current examples within South Africa to help all of you think through what are the issues around setting up the council. I decided in a discussion with her and with others that it would be good to look back a little bit. So I'm not going to talk about the National Strategic Plan and what it mandates and how we should go about it, because I think that would also be offensive. I haven't been part of these discussions, etc., and I do not want to come in at this stage of pretending to be the specialist on the issue of what we should do. My experience does dictate, in a sense, where I come from and where the red flags have been. And I thought I would highlight through this presentation some of the issues in the different processes that I've been involved in for almost 30 years on the issue of women's emancipation. I have a sort of 45-year work history, starting with working in a clothing factory. So, you know, and I'm about to retire from the University of Cape Town. So in a way, it's been good for me to participate in this, to reflect on some of the things in a time when we have more than enough cynicism and anger about what our country and what the world is looking like. I do think that we owe a huge debt of thanks to people who've been involved for the last 18 months to 2 years in pushing this agenda, and sometimes in really forceful ways, just to be seen and heard. You know, despite the World Health Organization telling governments around the world that this is now a pandemic, and we use that word as if it's still meaningless, you know, and I've always joked that if this was a medical condition, we would have declared a state of emergency around the world. So despite the word pandemic and epidemic proportions, etc., is language that's been used. I've used it in the 6 years that in the UN, you know, with member states and reporting to the different bodies. So we owe a huge thanks to all of you that have been involved in the marches, in the activism, in the advocacy, in your face activities to bring us to the stage where we now have a strategic plan. And I wish you all the best going forward as you have, and it's going to be contested terrain, thinking through what are the mechanisms you need, what sort of legislation you need to set up the council. Just on the point of legislation, last week I participated in this and heard a question asked, why legislation to set up a council as opposed to a policy? And I think that's a really important question where we have seen that policies can be ineffective. Policies do not hold anyone accountable. Whereas with law, it opens the possibility of litigation. It opens a possibility of doing accountability and state responsibility in a different way. So I think it's a valid question, and I think the push should be for legislation which sets out what a council should look like, what form and structure it should take, what the mandate is, etc. So having said that, I'm going to move away from that. I just want to say thank you again for having me. In terms of my presentation, the overview, I thought I would, and you know, it's impossible in a 90-minute session to kind of go through everything. So I thought I would briefly talk about the historical activism relating to the emancipation of women. And I talk about the emancipation of women because we know that violence is a cause and a consequence of the lack of freedom to be free from all forms of violence, from discrimination, from inequalities, etc. So emancipation, liberation are these really nice words that I think push an understanding. So I talk about the emancipation because this was a language that we were using, you know, in the last 30 odd years. I will also look at some of the lessons that we've learned from very briefly, the Women's National Coalition process, the National Gender Machinery discussions, and the national and provincial networks on violence against women, which existed, and I think maybe still exist in some watered down form in some provinces. The CGE, the Commission on Gender Equality, as a constitutionally mandated oversight and accountability mechanism, I'll talk a little bit about, and the UN mechanisms on oversight and accountability, especially the special procedure system, which I was a part of for 6 years. So that's briefly the outline. Just on that, I can share with the organizers 1 or 2 articles that for those of you who want to delve a little bit into the history of the national gender machinery discussions, etc. There was an article that I published in an Acta Juridica probably 10 years ago. So I recently saw this quote on the one of the Daily Maverick articles, and the quote is, "Why is it that come a crisis, the default position is always to establish a new unit or summon a new group of experts to develop a policy document no different from the last?" And the author, and I would love to know who it's a pseudonym, Professor Balthazar. I don't know who it is. So if anyone knows, drop me a note. But the person is not, the author's not referring to the National Strategic Plan. But when you kind of read between the lines, this unfortunately is going to be the kind of discourse. It's going to be questions, comments coming out, despite the imperative to focus on violence against women and girls. And I'm going to make no apologies to talk, I'm going to speak about violence against women and girls, because I am concerned about the gender-based violence, and I think all of you have had this discussion, but on a principled perspective, I speak about violence against women and girls. And the current climate in this country is going to give rise to these perspectives, from these kind of perspectives of, here we go, another mechanism, another policy document, another waste of money. And so my advice would be to keep that in mind, because you are going to have people who will come out of these including people that are in politics at the moment, you know, coming up with this we have a useless CGE, why are we starting, you know, why are we thinking of another council? One of the important issues during my term in the UN was the issue of specificity. You know, we can talk generically about women's rights, but if we don't hone in on what aspects of women's human rights are of deep concern, because of the structural nature, because of the institutional nature and the causes and consequences. And so for me, this council, we do need it. We need the specificity. We need that spotlight on violence against women and girls. And so I would make no apologies of why we need a law that sets up a new council that is specific to this issue. We need it. We may need it for 5 years. We may need it for 10 years, because violence against women and girls has an individual component, an institutional component, a communal component, and a structural component. It's really hard to think that we can talk generically about women's human rights, gender equality, non-discrimination, etc., without honing in on the specific aspects that are causes and consequences of violence against women and girls. So red flag there, I think I highlighted in bold. You are going to get that pushback. You are going to get a backlash. Do we need another law setting up another mechanism? Yes, we do. We do, because we're in a crisis situation, and we've been in a crisis situation for a long time, not only South Africa, around the globe. Taking a softly approach through a policy is not going to work. So bear that in mind when the negativity starts about, oh boy, here we go again, you know, another policy, another mechanism. Specificity for me on this issue is needed. It was needed yesterday, and just, you know, hold on to your truth that we need this, and we're going to move forward with coming up with legislation, coming up with a mechanism that will work. The next slide. Thanks, Kay. So looking back while moving forward is what I'm kind of going to focus on. And you are going to continue to have this discussion in the coming weeks. As I said, next week will be a really good discussion, which would bring the NSP into the discussion while looking at a few councils that currently exist. And, you know, as you start thinking through what would be a professional and ethical, a sustainable mechanism that will contribute further to the emancipation of women. The importance of institutional memory and the her story, you know, we do have a culture in this country of honoring what has gone before. We honor those on whose shoulders we stand, because none of us are experts. None of us learned all these things on our own. None of us had the power to open the doors that have been opened in terms of where we are now. So we need to honor that. But at the same time, my caution is that we cannot minimize or ignore certain patterns of conduct that we have seen over the years and more recently. So what are some of these patterns of conduct? Political patronage and the reward systems. We know that exists. We may be uncomfortable with talking about it because of our political ideologies and loyalties, etc. But we do need to talk about it. This is a reality of our lives in South Africa. I think yesterday's announcement of the new Member of Parliament sworn into the KZN legislature is an example of patronage and reward systems. And in our different forums, we're pushing back, we're criticizing, but we also need to do it as we think about a mechanism, about the legislation that's going to govern the mechanism, the appointment system, etc., that this is a reality in the country. Political appeasement on issues that disproportionately affect women. We have seen this as well. We've seen this when we complain about lack of legislation. When we complain about lack of visibility on issues. And, you know, activism has had to come out in ways that has been more aggressive and more vigorous to kind of get that visibility and those issues on the agenda. But the appeasement is part of it. And I think we've reached a point on the issue of violence against women and children to say no, no more. We want solid stuff, not political appeasement. Perceptions of ownership of the women's agenda. And we see this through language such as our women, certain ideological groupings, certain political factions, putting themselves forward as owning the women's agenda and being the spokesperson for all women in the country. And I do think that that kind of challenging the perceptions of ownership. We are all active agents in our own lives, in our workplaces, in, you know, wherever we choose to work or play. And as active agents, we need to put the message out there that we are all part and parcel of the ownership of the women's agenda. It doesn't belong to the ANC Women's League or the DA or whoever. It's us as citizens. And part of active agency is part of citizenship. It's part of us exercising our power as citizens. The vote is not the only way that we you know, we exercise our agency and power. So I think the perceptions, we have to challenge that all the time. The minimal understanding of a non-partisan approach. Again, you know, all these things come out of my work life and my activism. So the non-partisan approach, it's the sort of Trump-like version of you with me or you against me. No, it's not. We live in a different world. We live in a different country. We are a new country. We're 26 years old. We're trying to grow the country. And part of it is, you know, we have to work across our divides. This isn't about this is an ANC agenda or a DA agenda or an IFP agenda. We've lived through that when we were starting out 30 years ago, and we don't have to make that same mistake. Historical mistrusts and tensions. And I think, you know, these still exist. And whether we talk about town and gown academics and activists, whether we talk about older women and younger women, whether we talk about students and professors, whether we talk about being active in party politics or not, the tensions are there. And we need to be honest that they do exist. But it doesn't mean because of mistrust and tensions, we can't talk to each other and we can't look at each other and we can't say we do have common ground when it comes to many issues, but to this particular issue, there is common ground. And we need to be able to act as active agents in addressing some of this. And then the rhetoric versus the reality, this sort of constant, you know, we have the most amazing constitution, we have the most amazing legislation, we're the best in the world. No, we're not. The reality on the ground is that too many women are being killed, too many women are in abusive relationships, too many women are experiencing sexual harassment on the streets, in the workplace, cyberbullying, etc. And if we don't address that reality, then history repeats itself. Then we lose other generations because this becomes, and it has become the norm. Impunity has become the norm. Violence against women and girls has become, you know, normalized. And we need to move away from the rhetoric of keep on saying that, because it's like, you know, the definition of madness. How many times do you have to say it to kind of move away from, it's not going to change if we keep on saying it. So these are some of the things that, as we look back and move forward, would be red flags for me personally. I mean, it might be different for many of you listening in. Next slide. So our historical activism, so we do have a rich history of liberation struggles, and I think it makes us who we are. We never accept things on face value. We're always fighting about something or the other. And I think it's an honor and a privilege that, you know, we were born and raised in this country with that kind of human rights, social justice activism that's part and parcel of our liberation struggles. Our activism is robust. It's fearless. We put our bodies on the line, and it's a source of pride for many of us. And, you know, I think watching the activism in South Africa around this, around the violence against women and girls issue, it's actually something to be really proud of. It's been robust, it's been fearless, it's been in your face, it's about speaking truth to power. So it's something that's part of our cultural history, and I think we should celebrate it. But we also need to acknowledge that before 1913, the broader liberation struggles, the focus was on racial equality. Yes, in 1930, we did have women being active in the land deprivation struggles. In the 1950s, you had the more formal activism by women. So the formation of the Federation of South African Women, the adoption of the 1954 Women's Charter, which is the manifesto of the Federation, the 1956 March against the pass law system. And, you know, it was part of this larger liberation struggle, but our focus was largely on the racial struggle. And for, you know, our grandmothers and mothers' generation, they were being told, let's win the racial struggle, liberation struggle first, you know. And so that became part of the socialization. Where we see a more focused activism, you know, relating to the emancipation of women is from the late 1980s, when the serious political negotiations phase started. We see gender on the agenda in the ANC constitutional guidelines. We know that many meetings and workshops included people who were in exile, people who lived in the country. There was an important meeting, I think, in 1989 in Zambia. In 1990, we had the Malibonga conference in Amsterdam. And I'm sure some of you listening were part of these meetings. What we also see, which I've highlighted, is the role of the ANC Women's League in such processes. And again, you know, it's about honoring the shoulders, but it's also about acknowledging that these were not the only people in this. There were lots of other people that were pushing for a focus on the issue of women's emancipation. And of course, all these calls, initiatives, advocacy did lead to the 1990 ANC policy statement on the emancipation of women in South Africa. That's what, 20 years ago. And, you know, it's not that far away. Next slide. Some of the consequences of the historical activism, and I've spoken a little bit about the views on our women. You know, I cringed every time in the first 10 or 15 years of our democracy, every time a minister or a politician spoke about our women. And the sense of a lack of understanding that, no, women are active agents in their own lives. You know, we are citizens of this country. We're not second-class citizens. We don't belong to men, especially political leaders. So this view on our women, we need to be challenging as well. The ownership of the women's struggles. Okay, I'm sort of and these perceptions persist today about our women, the ownership of the women's issues, etc. And I, you know, sort of cynically put there, Stockholm syndrome. Are we hostages to our history in that we perpetuate the processes and systems? Or are we ready to reflect and act in courageous ways in challenging power, privilege, and the patriarchy in efforts to set up the council? And you're going to get the pushbacks. You're going to get the political rhetoric. You're going to get, you know, we need to play nice. But I do think that that time has passed, and now we need to do the active agency of pushing back on some of these things. So the Women's National Coalition, for some odd reason, something's blocking my slide. It was launched in 1992 as a mechanism for the process of national consultation and debate on women's needs and concerns. It did lead to the adoption in 1994 of the Women's Charter for Effective Equality. So we have the 1954 Charter, we have the 1994 Charter now. But while the charter process, this consultation, the advocacy, etc., was going on, simultaneously there was the parallel process to influence and shape the constitutional negotiation and drafting process, including inputs and structures which were necessary to ensure gender equality. So we had many people who'd been in exile, people within the country who had studied what had gone on the continent, in other countries, on, you know, when you're starting a new country, and you want to ensure equality, besides putting it in the constitution, what else do you need? What sort of mechanisms, what sort of structures would you need? And there were lots of models from the African continent. I mean, you know, the first, I think, Women's Commission or Gender Commission in Africa was in the 1950s. So we did have those kind of models to look at, to think about what we wanted. We also had the caution from our African sisters on the continent about how politicized these mechanisms can become. And there used to be a phrase used about the first wife syndrome, where the president's wife would get involved in mechanisms and structures that were set up in terms of gender equality. So we had information and models, but we also had cautions on what has worked, what has not worked, and where we should be, where the red flag should be, what should we be thinking about. So we were fortunate, in a sense, coming in late in the system. These mechanisms and structures had existed. They might have been human rights commissions in the global north, in Europe and in some other parts of the world. Whereas in Asia, in Africa, the model of specificity on women's human rights was about setting up women's commissions or gender commissions, etc. And I think we learned from those and sort of had the discussions at the provincial levels, at the local levels, at the national level of what is it that we would want. First of all, what would we want in the Constitution? So substantive equality in the Constitution, non-discrimination in the Constitution, but what were the mechanisms and structures? So that was, largely the Women's National Coalition process. Next slide. No, the National Gender Machinery slide, please, Kay. So, in some ways, we also have a problem of thinking we're exceptional. We're this amazing country that came out of a terrible history without a civil war. And we looked for what were the best things that we could get, that we could negotiate and that we could demand. So the National Gender Machinery Framework, as it was called, and of course, at this time, there were also the international UN developments, 1995, Beijing, kind of promoting the notion of national gender machineries in different countries, etc. So, we learned, and we had the luxury of having information to draw on. So one of the things that we thought about, and we were strategic about, we didn't want one thing, just a commission. So strategically, politically, where
Good afternoon, everyone. May you kindly bear with us as we just try to get Professor back on the screen. I know in some areas we have been experiencing some bit of load shedding, and that is also impacting on our connections and our networks. So please kindly bear with us as we try to get her back on. I think she's coming through. Professor, can you hear me?
Okay. Rumbi, I'm back. It was my internet, and it might be also the load shedding. Okay.
Yes.
Thank you. I'll keep an eye on this internet thing because, yeah. Okay. So we wanted an admin body in the presidency at the highest level, having the ear of the president, etc. We didn't get it initially. What we got was an office on the status of women, but under the deputy presidency. I think it was Thabo Mbeki. It did get moved when he became president to the presidency, but it was an administrative body to serve as an internal monitoring and evaluation structure, etc. Then within Parliament, we wanted a committee exclusively to focus on gender equality, and the Joint Monitoring Committee became the oversight body within Parliament in terms of all legislation, etc. And the third element was the Independent Commission as the oversight body in this promotion and protection. And that got included in the Constitution. The OSW was created through a policy, not through legislation at that time. The Joint Monitoring Committee, of course, it's a committee of Parliament. Parliament has its own rules. So I suppose the victory was getting something included in the Constitution, which was the Commission on Gender Equality is one of the 6 Chapter 9 institutions. Next slide. We also had networks on violence against women at the national and provincial level. And at the founding stage, I think it was at that time, I don't know, I suppose we still called it the Department of Welfare, which is now Social Development. And I kind of vaguely remember it starting because someone in the welfare department had come up with the idea, had some seed funding, brought people together, and it was seen as a public-private partnership at that time, you know, and it was quite solid at the beginning, this public-private partnership, because it was a time when people wanted to work together. They wanted to work with the new government, wanted to work in making this the country that we all want it to be. So it was one of the more healthy, I would say, public-private partnerships in its initial stages. As the years went on, a lack of political support for it, as well as funding cuts. DFID was a huge funder. DFID pulled the money out. And, you know, it was largely left to civil society to sort of keep these things, these mechanisms going. And some provinces managed to get small bits of money from different funders to keep it going. But DFID was a huge funder at the beginning. And one of the red flags for me is when donors come in to support something and be enthusiastic so that you can set up the mechanisms and structures because it's needed, and then think that in 3 years they can pull out. There's no opportunity for sustainability, right? And you can't expect another funder to be as generous. And the first 3 years are about setting systems and structures in place. And so a red flag here for me would be this shouldn't become a public-private partnership of a council with an undue burden being placed on civil society. Whether it's about convening meetings, whether it's about research, whether it's about advocacy, that civil society should be scrambling around, looking for money, trying to make this work. We all want it to work. And so when we think of a public-private partnership in a council, in a legal form, that's a red flag for me. It's don't make this the burden of the 51% civil society members who will be sitting on the council without thinking through the funding issue, etc., and having expectations that civil society will continue to carry the burdens. The next slide. Okay.
Good afternoon once again. You will be seeing on your screens a poll. Please do just vote on the poll. This is to help us inform us on how we can do better with the webinars. So it's just a quick poll, and then we'll get Professor back. It's just a short break. Thank you for that. And Professor, we are getting back to you. Please do continue. Thank you.
Thank you, Rumbi. All right. So that was very sort of brief on the Women's National Coalition, National Gender Machinery, and the networks on violence against women that existed. I mean, there is a rich history, and I can send some references of articles that have been written. But we don't have the time to do that today. So what are some of the lessons? And I've been trying to flag some of the red flags, you know, as I speak. And some of the lessons learned, that the processes that you've engaged in to bring us to this point of the National Strategic Plan are very similar. People were, largely women, were able to come together across our differences, across our divides, to collaborate on issues of concern. And you've done that, and you know, we kind of see this, the result is this national strategic plan and a lot of hard work. So the lessons, you know, emanate from past sort of experiences. We are able to come together across our differences and divides, to collaborate. The ability to conduct consultations, national campaigns, research, educative work, advocacy, etc. You know, the use of comic books, the use of the radio, TV, etc. People going out in the field into rural areas to ask women. And this was part of what we learned from our constitutional negotiation processes, to go out into the field and ask people, you know, what would they want in a constitution? What is their understanding? So, you know, I remember clearly doing some work in rural areas trying to ask people what they understood by the right to life. You know, we want in the Constitution, but what does it mean to you? Because it means different things to different people. So for some people, it's about the death penalty. For other people, it's about the right to termination of pregnancy, the abortion debates, etc. And, you know, trying to identify what are the needs, what's the reality, what are the needs, what should we have in a constitution? What sort of mechanism should we have? What are women's realities on the ground that new government should know about? So we have the ability to do that, to do those consultations, those campaigns. You've done it already with this, you know, preceding the National Strategic Plan. But you're still going to have to do this work, because these webinars are really educative. And they're going to be out there. People who have access to the internet are going to be able to see it. But how do you give life to it to people who don't have the same kind of advantages that many of us do have? You have to do those consultations when you're setting up the council, when you are reviewing the work of the council, the campaigns once the council is set up. There might be the pre-campaigns about membership of the council, and so all this sort of work that we, you know, have done and you've done, it has to carry on. Trying to identify needs and aspirations of women, I think that ship has sailed. We know, maybe we know in the macro picture, we do know in micro spaces as well, but we need to do more work on that, especially if we want to set up a mechanism that is inclusive, that is that honors every woman and girl child in this country. We have to find ways of doing those consultations, that research, so that when we review the work of the council, when we review government's response to what has been set out in the National Strategic Plan, when we review ourselves as civil society and what we do, we come from a place of integrity, of this is not just rhetoric, this is not just nice to have, this comes from a deep sense of consultative, educative advocacy work. Next slide. We also have to remember that, you know, the lessons learned from the Women's National Coalition days, the National Gender Machinery, the networks on violence, those initiatives took place in a different time with a different outlook on mechanisms and structures, and also our views on partnerships. We were less cynical about public-private partnerships, about supporting the state. But we are in a different place from where we were in those days of the late 80s, early 90s onwards. And so time and place is important as you think through what a council should look like. The things that we learned, the ways that we did, the methodologies that we followed may have no relevance to you at all today. Or they might have one or two lessons for you. But I think if we forget that we're in a different time now, and not only in terms of, well, we've tried things for 26 years, we have legislations, we have mechanism and structures, but we're also in a different political space now, where there is so much of anger, there's so much of negativity, that you are now functioning in some ways in a less forgiving space, a less responsive space. We didn't have that. We were all hands on deck. We have to achieve this goal of emancipation of women. And despite us having concerns about conceptual and practical challenges, including implementation, enforcement, oversight, accountability issues, membership issues, appointment processes, etc., the time was such that we kind of said, look, we can address that later. We want to build now, we don't want to destroy. And to build, you know, we had to suck it up on many occasions, on many issues, so that we could move forward. But you are in a different space 26 years down the line. You know, I saw this somewhere and I can't remember, and if anyone knows who said this, let me know. Power does not readily acknowledge privilege, right? We know that the values of consensus decision-making and Ubuntu have precluded discussions on individual, institutional, and structural oversight and accountability issue. We need to challenge power in respectful ways, because power does not want to acknowledge its privilege, the space, the voice, the visibility that it has, that has been denied to others. And when we raise it, we're being angry Black women, we're being troublesome, we want to destroy. No, we don't. We want to build a country that has an ethical basis. We want to build a country where we acknowledge power and privilege and the patriarchy. And we don't want to pretend it doesn't exist. Because I think if we do that in terms of a new council, if we don't do this challenging in a way and surfacing privilege wherever we see it, it's not just about race, you know, there's privilege of class, of status, of geographic location, etc. And if we don't do that, then we're not speaking truth to power and moving forward on a mechanism that has specificity, that is needed, that has to be sustainable, but that has to be grounded in integrity and not political affiliations and reward systems, etc. Next one. So coming to the Commission, where I served 5 years as the Parliamentary Commissioner, it's an oversight and accountability mechanism. It's governed by the provisions in the Constitution, and it's in both the interim and the final Constitution. I think it's 181, sections 181, 187. And then the enabling legislation is the CGE Act, the Commission on Gender Equality Act, which was adopted in 1996. Could you go back on that one? Thanks, Kay. The second point that I'm raising is the importance of embedding this mechanism in the Constitution. And this was a fight, you know, should we just have a legislative body through secondary legislation? Should we have a policy to set up the mechanism? And we had learned from the continent, we had learned from other mechanisms that we need to make it hard, make it harder for a new parliament, a new executive to get rid of it. So when you have it embedded in the Constitution, and yes, there have been reviews and discussions that do we really need so many Chapter 9 institutions? The CGE has failed. You know, why don't we just merge it with the Human Rights Commission, etc.? It's harder to get rid of it because you need a 2/3 majority in Parliament. So again, it goes back to a question that was raised last week about embedding something in the law, in a policy. And, you know, here we have something that's embedded in the Constitution as well. And we may all have our views on whether we get rid of a mechanism because of its history, of its problematic history or perceptions of failure. But that doesn't mean that we should make it easy for the legislature to say, no, we're merging the Human Rights Commission and the Gender Commission. We haven't reached a stage in this country of the emancipation of all women in this country. And so a mechanism such as this is needed. Because when you have, and I've seen this in the work that I've done over the years, and particularly when I visit human rights commissions in my country investigations for the UN, gender is not quite high up on the list on their agenda. And so human rights commissions have huge mandates, and they may, you know, pick and choose the kind of issues where they're bringing in women's rights and the gender issues, but it's not necessarily high on their agenda. And so if we do lose the specificity, then I think it makes it harder when we want to talk about the specificities, whether it's on violence against women and girls, whether it's about the land issues, whether it's about, you know, recognition of religious marriages or whatever. It does make it harder when we want to talk about the broader issues that are implicated in the emancipation and liberation of women. So I do think in any discussions we have, we need to think about that, despite the failings or perceptions of failure of these institutions. So the enabling legislation, I think, might be a useful one for people who are thinking through what should be in a legislation on what should be the mandate of the council. I think it's worth reading the CGE Act, and there might have been amendments which I haven't followed, because it fleshes out quite nicely the powers, the functions, the composition, procedural aspects, etc. So it's worth, for those of you that are already thinking through what should be in a legislation, what should be the mandate, etc. It's worth looking at that. Next slide. So where are we? So the enabling legislation of the Gender Commission Act as well as the Human Rights Commission Act, I suppose those two would be most relevant. It provides a roadmap for the form and functions of the institution that you want to set up. All institutions have internal policies which provide further clarity on the implementation of the mandate. So, you know, in an ideal world, people may argue, let's put everything into the legislation so that we don't lose out. That's not the way that law works. You know, you can't anticipate everything and put it into the legislation. There's a saying that the more you define things, the more you leave out, the more you lose. And it's impossible for one piece of legislation setting out a mechanism to have everything in it. So you have to, we all have to accept that once a council is set up, there will be internal policies that the council itself would reach consensus on to provide further clarity on implementation of the mandate, etc. And hopefully that also occurs through a, you know, collaborative, consultative process that when internal policies are being devised, that you have the same kind of robustness in terms of activism and participation. Decision-making in sort of councils, in the Gender Commission, decision was reached through consensus. And if we didn't, because we all are different, we came from different walks of life, etc., failing consensus, and there were occasions when there was no consensus, and I can tell you it was, some sessions were pretty ugly, because it was as if we all had to, subscribe to the same text on issues and reach consensus. And that's when you go to the vote. I know that there's a cultural history, a political history of ideology of consensus making. Don't go to the vote. And I've seen this in the UN as well, where the Human Rights Council, the General Assembly tries not to go to the vote on resolutions, etc. But I think if something doesn't feel right, then consensus shouldn't be pushed onto people. Then we need to find a way of voting on issues. The Gender Commission used to report on its activities to Parliament, and of course we report to the whoever on finances, to Treasury on finances. The parliamentary reporting process, and this is in the CGE Act, the parliamentary reporting processes, I think, were very dissatisfactory. Because you go in, you have this fancy presentation, you have the glossy report, and there's no real engagement. And I know there was a mechanism set up in Parliament so that the Chapter 9 institutions can be held accountable. Not about why did you do this program and why did you spend money here? Because I think that's the job of Treasury, to be asking you how you spent your money. But your programmatic activities of the Commission arose from the work that we were doing on the ground, whether it was our research, whether it was our public inquiries, hearings, etc. But for Parliament not to engage substantively with that was, you would feel like all this work and all the expense of flying people in from Joburg to Parliament, etc. And then you walk away dissatisfied. And as a lawyer, I always felt that Parliament was not holding us accountable, because Parliament has an oversight role and they should have been holding us accountable. And I don't know if they do it better now, but it's something to bear in mind. There is no formal requirement for the Gender Commission to report or account to the executive, right? And it's something to remember when you think about the legislation. But in this kind of consensus ideological world we live in, the minister and the presidency, I think it was Fahad at that time, the chair of the commission had built up a relationship of consulting with him, and then we'd get invited to the West Wing sometimes to talk about certain issues. But formally, from a legal perspective, there is no formal requirement to report or account to the executive. And this is something that I think, as you think of a council, I'm not sure what the NSP is saying on that, to think about. The commission, of course, is, in terms of the constitution, in terms of its enabling legislation, the values that underpin the commission are of transparency, openness, public participation, good governance, etc. I know some of you might be smirking at some of this based on your histories with the Commission. Independence, impartiality, accountability, these are the values that are embedded in the Constitution and the enabling legislation. So it's something worth looking at as you think through a commission. Next slide. The community challenges. And I put in something there as well in my own slide, the challenges in the successful functioning of this constitutional body, that it's not unique, that similar problems with other Chapter 9 institutions have existed and continue to exist. So I'm not picking on the Commission. These are just broad problems that were experienced and, have been experienced by other Chapter 9 institutions. We see this with the current challenges with the public protector, etc. So one of the challenges, one of the problems was the broad and the vague sort of wording of the mandate. And it can lead to different understandings, different interpretations. You know, we came from different disciplines, we came from different geographic locations, etc. So in terms of both the staff and the commissioners, this can lead to kind of tensions. And I think, you know, I don't know if the state law advisor is helping or the Justice Department is helping with the legislation around the council, but it's something to be aware of in terms of, I'm not talking about being so specific that you exclude a whole lot of things, but it's a problem that we had in the commission, which can lead to tensions because people have different understandings and interpretations. In the time that I served in the Gender Commission, I was the only lawyer on that commission. And of course, I was the only one in terms of, I'll come back to the appointment stuff. So, you know, we did sort of seek the advice of the Department of Justice, which was seen as our, I suppose, the body that we went to, the conduit. And we did get in an academic to come and talk about what the mandate was actually in terms of the Constitution and the enabling legislation. So that's something to think about because it can lead to tensions because, you know, the people that are going to be part of the council will come from so many different spaces and experiences, and so the understandings, the interpretation. So it might be a good idea once the mandate is set up is to have this kind of webinar session so that people are on the same page. Now, I don't know, I see a message there. Okay, I'm okay, I think, in terms of network connectivity at the moment. The appointment procedure, now that's for the Gender Commission, it was through a parliamentary process. One of the sort of tensions was, does the president appoint? My legal understanding has always been, no, Parliament follows a procedure, there's a call for nominations, a special committee set up in Parliament, they shortlist, they interview, and then they send a list to the president, and I saw the president's task as being a rubber stamp. During Madiba's time, apparently with the Human Rights Commission, he did make a change. He included someone who hadn't gone through that process. In the Gender Commission time, during my time, that didn't happen. The list that went from Parliament to the President was signed off on. Another issue that I don't, you know, it's not Parliament's fault, but a lot of the nominations that were received came from politicians, from political parties, trade unions, etc. And, you know, once I was in the commission having these discussions of who had nominated you, it arose that my nomination was the only one that came from, I suppose, civil society, from academia. And so it can bring in the politicization of the appointment process can happen inadvertently because of the kind of nominations that are received and the shortlisting process. So it's something to keep an eye on, because you might end up with appointees who got in because they were nominated by their constituencies, by their support base, and then you end up with a group of people who want things to function a certain way, who think a certain way, and who think that you're problematic if you think differently. So that would be a caution for me in terms of the appointment process. Make sure that it's as transparent as possible. There's scrutiny about potential appointees, etc. And the more you have people being involved of scrutinizing, it's like what the happens in terms of judicial appointments now. There are groups that, you know, every time someone comes forward and put themselves forward for the judiciary, there's a kind of scrutiny that's going on. of where you've come from, what's your work ethos, what are your views on certain issues, etc. And I don't think it's a problem to demand that as well, of a really strict scrutiny in terms of appointment, because your goal is ultimately an ethical, sustainable council. Another issue that arises because of the legislation is the limited and unenforceable powers to achieve the mandate. So we could make recommendations, we could come up with pretty reports, and that's about it. So you have to think through for a council, you know, what sort of powers do they have? Can they subpoena? Can they demand when a government department is refusing to provide reports or respond to a complaint or whatever? Do you have the powers to kind of enforce this, to say, we have subpoena powers, I'm going to subpoena you, you have to appear in front of the council? You know, and I think it does depend on the mandate. What is the mandate, and what sort of powers are attached? So it might be, again, worth looking at the Chapter 9 institutions and their powers and mandates. The changes in the political climate and leadership, which can lead to the loss of support. I mean, we had the most amazing first chairperson of the Gender Commission, and then she left and, you know, went off to become an ambassador or whatever it was. So we also had a different political climate where there wasn't as much support. And I mean, I think within the first term of the Gender Commission, particularly opposition political parties were asking the question, do we really need this? You know, do we really need the Gender Commission? And it was partly because they didn't see the value, they couldn't understand that all institutions have teething problems, you know, but the problems in the CGE were so visible and out there. The dirty linen was being aired. And so that's all they saw was the dirty linen, the lack of effectiveness, and then could come up with, you know, things like, do we really need this? So I think when the political climate changes, you might not have the same political will, the same political support when the leadership changes, and it can lead to a loss of support. And so you have to ask yourself, how dependent are you going to be on that sort of political climate leadership for your existence as a council? So yeah, next slide, please. Financial constraints, which we all know, know about, and that leads to implementation challenges. Consequences are reputational. So you are seen as the CGE was once labeled as, oh, the August the 9th body, because they were only seen on August the 9th in certain parts of the country. So there's reputational consequences when you set up the council and then you get starved of resources. Being dependent on donor funding to run the council is going to be a challenge, you know, and so you have to think about what it means, because the state has a responsibility. The state has an obligation, right, to address these issues. And if a council is going to be the mechanism that's going to serve as the think tank for government to think through where are the challenges, where are the problems, then the financial issues, and many of you in your advocacy and activism have raised this issue. Where do you get your money from? This was a problem in the CGE. Our money, we were not a government department, so our money didn't come from Treasury to us. The money went to the Department of Justice. And the Department of Justice, and we said, look, we have oversight over the Department of Justice as a constitutional body. So if we have oversight over you, how can you be holding the purse strings? And the Department of Justice would always argue that we're not taking away any of your money. I mean, out of this sort of bundle of budget that the Department of Justice got, you know, the Chapter 9 Institute, well, the Gender Commission and the Human Rights Commission, I think, would get their funding through that. And the Department of Justice argument used to be that we're just a conduit for the funding. So it comes from Treasury, you go to Treasury, you are the one that, you know, takes your budgets, you tell them what you want to do, that you want to set up provincial offices, that you want to do this programmatic work. We just the conduit of that money. So it comes to us, and Treasury would never give you what you wanted, right? So there was a sense of resentment that maybe the Department of Justice was taking the money. But if the Department of Justice is just a conduit, because the council cannot be a department on its own and be a direct in terms of the way our system works, our governance system works. So the council may not directly get the money from the Treasury, but do you have input so that Treasury understands what money you're going to need and why you're going to need it and why you need to set up provincial and local offices, etc. So I think that's something to discuss with the Department of Justice if they're going to draft the legislation, to discuss with the finance minister, etc., about how it's going to work, what's going to be the conduit, do we have a say, or are we just going to be told by the Ministry of Justice, here's your money, that's all you're going to get because we have austerity measures, we don't have money. So I think that's something from a financial perspective to think about. I just want to go back one, you don't have to move the slides, Kay, but just on that appointment issue, strangely, in the Commission on Gender Equality Act, it set out that the president appoints the chair of the commission, right? And I have over the years seen this as very much a political move. The Human Rights Commission doesn't have that. The commissioners decide who's going to be the chair of the Human Rights Commission. So I think it's something also to think about if you have a council with a hierarchy and you have a chair, etc. To go back to some of the challenges, the lack of shared understanding of concepts of oversight and accountability within the institutions and outside of it, so outside of it is, yes, we did have a complaints mechanism where cases could come to the commission. The cases would be looked at through the lens of what is a pervasive and widespread problem that we should strategically take up based on our limited resources. So every bread and butter case couldn't be taken on. And I think that's where people outside the institution couldn't understand the oversight accountability issue because they needed a service. But we were not a service provider per se as such, right? We were not an NGO. And I think, again, it's part of our history of not having had these institutions and mechanisms during apartheid, setting up new ones and learning as we went, but also doing enough educative work so that society understands when you have these kind of institutions, what can they do? They can't just become another sort of service provider because that's not their task. They have the task of oversight and accountability. If they're going to become service providers or research mechanisms, then you lose out on the oversight and accountability. Another issue is staffing issues and relationships between what I call the board of commissioners and the staff. So commissioners are seen as policymakers, staff are seen as implementers. You have highly qualified staff in senior positions as directors of units, and how do you reach a point of having a relationship without creating a hierarchy? And this was a source of tension, I think, in the first and the second set of phases of the commission. I think commissioners can act as if they know it all, instead of having a relationship with the staff, that your staff are your experts. They're not making the policy, but they're guiding you in terms of you making the policy. They're guiding you in terms of, public education and information. But then there's also the flip side where staff can be very arrogant about their knowledge base. They might be experts on labor issues. They might be experts on governance issues. But to treat commissioners as if they're idiots can lead to more tensions. So there was always that kind of push and pull in terms of staffing issues and relationships. CEOs and the power, and the Gender Commission, the Human Rights Commission have had their fair share of CEOs, all sorts of allegations about abuse of power and authority and resources in some instances. And unfortunately, I think in the Gender Commission and with one of the CEOs in the Human Rights Commission, there was an absence of proper fair labor processes in getting rid of the person, and then the person went to the labor courts, etc., etc. But I do think that, I know that the NSP allows for a CEO. I do think that there needs to be a strong discussion about that, because it can lead to problems about power and privilege and access, etc. Perceptions of lack of accountability of CGE to the constituency of women, that's a huge problem, I think. That's why, the CGE can be labeled as that August the 9th people. If there's no visibility, there's no sense that society sees what you're doing, sees that you work in their interest. And accountability is not just about the CGE reporting to Parliament, right? Or to the Treasury about how they spent the money. It's accountability to the constituency that you ought to be serving. And I think that's a discussion on its own that one needs to think about. The next slide.
Prof, sorry to interrupt you for a few seconds here. We're just running out of time, so I'm going to ask you to pick.
Okay. So another challenge is the shared understanding of such institutions. And, 20 years ago, many of us saw this as a political and strategic space. It wasn't about a career, about CV building, etc. Problems of cult of personality, egos, entitlement, reward systems, etc., which I've spoken about. Next slide, Kay. So the UN, and I think the law policy discussion that you had last week, in international law, we have the same. We have hard law, soft law. Treaty bodies like CEDAW, the Convention on the Elimination of All Forms of Discrimination Against Women, their mandate emanates through a treaty. That's considered hard law. So covenants, treaties are hard law. Hard law, it's set out in stone. It's hard to change it. I mean, you have to go back to the drawing board, and member states are not happy with that. It can be restrictive. So what do treaty bodies do? They use their interpretation skills to kind of include. So CEDAW doesn't have a provision on violence against women. And what does the CEDAW committee do? They interpret discrimination, violence against women as discrimination, and then come up with 3 or 4 general recommendations. Not always in a good way. Next slide, please. Okay, so the system of special procedures, which was the system that I was in for 6 years, it's created through soft law, through resolutions. And resolutions are short, sometimes half a page, sometimes a page and a half, but it allows for more latitude in how we do your work. And we are an oversight and accountability mechanism, the special procedure system, seen as the eyes and ears of the UN human rights systems, produce thematic reports, which push the conceptual understandings. I mean, I can't even remember how many countries you go to where people at the highest levels, you talk about violence against women and they start talking about domestic violence as if those two are equated, and that's it. Country mission reports are about investigations. You come up with a report with recommendations, etc. So it is an oversight and accountability mechanisms. If you go on the High Commissioner's website, there are sort of generic documents which explain the special procedures systems more. And I think I'm done. Is the next. Like we have problems in our national level mechanisms and oversights, you have the same problems in the international system. Enforcement, what does it mean for different constituencies? For some people, enforcement is about having a judicial process, having a penalty, having a sanction, etc., right? UN system doesn't do that. There's reporting, there's shadow reports, there's country level investigations by treaty bodies, by special procedures, and we all come up with reports and recommendations. So we do naming and shaming, but it can be dissatisfying for people because it doesn't change the status quo. So that's something to think about. What do you want your council to be, Is it just about naming and shaming? Is it about doing what I call excavation. Then there are financial constraints faced by these mechanisms as well. There's conceptual understanding differences as well. Appointment process is also more or less similar in terms of call for nominations, and then it goes through a committee of member states and goes through that. For the treaty bodies, I think it's a more political process because you have to be nominated by your government to sit on a treaty body. For special procedures, you don't have to. Civil society had nominated me, so, you know, the appointment process is a bit different. But I think the kind of things we see at a national level, we see in the UN system as well. So we shouldn't feel despondent that, you know, everything's going wrong here, because I can tell you it's a mess in other regional and the international system as well on the issues of women's human rights, etc. And okay, that's the last one, I think. Thank you very much to all of you. I know I've taken a really long time. It's almost 2 hours, no, an hour and a half. Back to Rumbi.
Thank you very much, Prof. Thank you for such a brilliant but very comprehensive presentation. I think we have certainly learned quite a lot from your presentation. Thank you very much, Prof. Now, because we have been live streaming this presentation on our Facebook platform, so we have some questions and answer. We're going to go into a question and answer session. I know we're running a bit out of time, so I'm just going to quickly go to the questions and just also ask you, Prof, to be as brief but comprehensive again when you answer the questions as well. Also, just to indicate,
it's a skill I don't have.
Yes, just to indicate that we are also on Twitter as well. You can please follow us on Twitter, and we are on Facebook. So please also follow us on Facebook as well. The questions that we have for you, Prof, I'm just going to go, it's just about 4 questions that I have. So I'll just say them out and then you can answer, Prof. The first question is, what does it mean to work together when there is evidence of violence, of inclusion? The movement has been polarized because of the hurt of trying to build together. And then the second question is, how does the legislative framework begin to address the red flags that you alluded to? And then question 3 is, the NSP envisages some type of collaboration with the gender machinery. How would you say this is the effective type of collaboration? And then the final question is, you cautioned against the expectation that CSOs will continue to carry the burden. How can the relationship with aid agencies be strengthened to ensure that CSOs are supported? Please go ahead, Prof.
And I have 2 minutes. Yes. All right. I think, what does it mean to work together? There is polarization, and there will be, because we're not homogenous. We're not homogenous. We may be women, but we come from so many different spaces, etc. So the only advice I can give there is, do you want it? Do you want a mechanism? Do you want a council that is effective, that is respectful, that is responsive, and that is sustainable? If you do, then look at the bigger picture and see how, despite the hurt, despite the exclusion, etc., how can you make yourself become part of something that's sustainable, something that's going to be, and it means we have to suck up a lot of things. We have to suck up being rendered invisible, but we have to find those spaces where we can put ourselves out there without aggression and saying, I'm here. I have something to contribute. Can you see me? Can you hear me? And that's part of our Ubuntu, isn't it? That's part of our struggle. So I would say, I know these processes are hard, and I think maybe, and maybe I'm being idealistic, maybe it was easier during our time because there was a larger enemy out there, the apartheid system, and we needed to challenge it at every level to say we could be better, we could do better. But yours is different. It's more personal. It's more exclusionary in ways that the hurt remains. But how can you rise above that? And I know it's a tall order. I'm doing a Madiba and saying rise above it, you know, and see how. And I think the webinars like this, the collective, the call to action collective needs to be responsive to the disjunctures and the hurt that people are feeling, and ask themselves, where's the healing space in this, you know, because we can't keep on fighting if we want something. The red flags and the legislation, I think, hopefully now that you have the slides, that you will take the red flags and whoever's, you know, in the group, because I'm not sure that, you know, 400 people are going to be sitting and drafting a legislation, but it's something to have that discussion with. I think it's the Ministry of Justice that's going to be assisting with the legislation, is to sit with them and say, these are the red flags that over the weeks different people have raised. How do we accommodate that? What should we be looking at? And I don't think that we have to look outside of South Africa necessarily on this issue, on the legislation issue. I think we have enough sort of commissions of inquiry and councils and whatnot. So the red flags, someone needs to take responsibility to pull out the red flags. And then say, this is a red flag that links to legislation. This is a red flag that links to the structure of the council. This is a red flag that links to implementation issues. This one links to accountability of the council issues. And I think if you do that disaggregation, it will make life easier as you think about, so is this red flag something that we need to flag to the drafters of the legislation, or is this about the council, the appointment process, the accountability of council members, etc. The National Strategic Plan mechanism, which will be the council, and the CGE and the Human Rights Commission, effective collaboration. I can see if there isn't a shared understanding, there might be a sense of this is a competitive process as opposed to a collaborative process. Some people might want to be the top dogs and others seen as you are new, you're going to be lower down the hierarchy. There is no need for a hierarchy, but there's a need for the Chapter 9 institutions in particular to be educated that the specificity that is being demanded of us through the NSP and a council is non-negotiable. The Gender Commission can say, oh, but we work on violence against women. Yes, but you didn't get it right. But we're not saying you don't have a role. What we're saying is we need this expert special mechanism structure with its guiding legislation so that we can start seeing results. You will be part of collaborations, you know, if we're doing an inquiry on how COVID has impacted domestic violence, you can bring in the CGE. But I think that there shouldn't be this ownership issue that a Chapter 9 institution is saying, but we work on this, this is ours. There should be rather an educative component of the different mechanisms, the Joint Monitoring Committee, which I think is defunct now, if I'm not mistaken. Now we have a women's ministry. But if the different role players can understand that it's not taking away anything from them, it's about the specificity, the spotlight to strengthen the work that they do. And this council may not exist in 10 years, you know, but the need is now. The specificity, the shining the light on it is for now, and having a specific body is for now. So I think that collaboration is going to take a lot of frank conversations, that we're not taking anything away from you. We're not saying you have failed. We're not saying you don't do this. What we're saying is we need this specific mechanism now with the specific focus. The CSOs and carrying the burden. I mean, you know, I think the second half of that question was, how do we get the donor community? And so effectively what we're doing is, we might be opening the door to letting the state off the hook. They might help with the seed funding to set up the mechanism. And then say, okay, austerity, COVID, blah, blah. So I wouldn't go down that route as yet. I would say we need the funding that helps us to set up, to get the legislation done, to get the appointment process done, to set up the mechanism. But we need you as the state to take responsibility for funding that and funding it in, I don't want to say 2 years or whatever, because it is an obligation. And that's another challenge we face in this country. We don't talk enough about state responsibility and state obligations. That's a state obligation. During the time of the foundation phase, when we're setting up in those 3 years and finding our feet, etc., we can come up with special projects. And I'm using the generic we. I'm not saying that I'm included, but generic we. To set up with specific projects that you want the donors to fund. But it shouldn't be about the core funding of the council and its work. It's about those specific projects that you want, the research that you want to do on gender-related killings of women or whatever, because that research is important to underpin the strategy of your educative work, your policy work, etc. So that's where I would go to the burden, to the donors, is on very specific activities, but my core activities, I want my state to be responsible for funding that. Don't let the state off the hook. They have money. We don't need to be spending so much on the military. We don't need so much of corruption. There is money. And if they want this to work, if they are serious and committed to the women and children of this country, then we need to say to them, it's not negotiable. In that foundational phase, it might be 3 years. You have to put your money where your mouth is. And this is what, I said in the West Wing of the Union buildings to Minister Pahad, you can't talk about poverty and you're not putting any money. And, and his comment at that time was, we need to distinguish between relative poverty and intense poverty. And I said, go and say that to the woman who can't feed her children, Go and say that, if the state doesn't come to the table now, then we have to ask ourselves, where's the commitment? They have to commit to that budget. So you have to do the work of the budget, etc. You have to be strong standing up to the kind of political maneuverings about, oh, but the Gender Commission can do this. No, you need one body that's focused, that's specific on this issue so that we can see results. And we can stop hitting our head against the wall and saying, been there, done that, tried it, got the T-shirt. Yeah, I hope that answers. I don't want to sound negative, but I think, I'm almost 65, so I'm tired also because I've done this too many times. Rumbi,
Thank
are you there?
Thank you very much. I see we have some people that have also raised their hands that would like to ask some questions. I have noted Lungelisa Jimenez and Kinampi, so we're going to start with those two. Lungelisa, please go ahead with your question. Please unmute yourself and go ahead with your question. Okay, I'm not sure if Lungelisa is still with us. Pinampi, please go ahead with your question whilst we wait for Lungelisa.
Seems like the sound is not.
Okay, I think we're having a struggle with maybe their connections and they're not able. Our third person is Griselda Grootboom. Please go ahead, Griselda. Please do unmute yourself so that we can be able to hear you.
Hi, thank you. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear
Yes.
you, Griselda.
Thank you so much for the opportunity. And again, sorry, thank you, Professor. What an incredible presentation. You did sort of really push on the fact that your focus is very important on women and girls. And my question is, with the NSP documents, we read through it, and I am a survivor of prostitution and sex trafficking. I feel there's no sort of sound around what women and girls will going to be feeling in this state of, prostitution itself. And my question to you, knowing that prostitution itself has such a lot of violence in it because somebody buys you, owns your body, do whatever they want to in that hour. How do you feel about the calling on legalization of prostitution or decriminalization of prostitution? Since you did say and open your presentation on women and girls, our higher rates at Embrace Dignity in Kwanele, a lot of women that have exited prostitution have said that there's a very violent and mostly rape that also takes place in prostitution. What are your thoughts on this law, and what are your thoughts also around of legalizing prostitution? Thank you very, very, very much again.
Thank you, Griselda. Okay, I think you need to mute yourself. Okay. So what you're raising is what you see as what I call a normative gap, a gap in the legislation, right? That's not addressing the decriminalization, the legalization debates, etc. Trafficking, we do have legislation, but the trafficking linked, the prostitution link is not there. So I'm wondering whether ultimately, whatever mechanism is set up, I would expect, like we did in the Gender Commission, one of the first things that the Commission did was to look at what were the gaps in legislation. And of course, in 1996, there were huge gaps in legislation that were not covered, that addressed forms of discrimination and violence, etc., that impacted women and girls disproportionately. And so the Domestic Violence Act, I was on the task team that drafted that legislation, the sexual offences legislation, which many of my friends and colleagues have been involved in, etc. And so it's a process over 26 years where the identification of a gap in the law may come through civil society, may come through an individual, may come through the what's our South African Law Reform Commission because of some complaint they've received or research they've done. It might come from the Minister of Justice himself. So I see the council as a conduit for this discussion, right? So if it's not being reflected at the moment in the National Strategic Plan, it's because I think the sort of catch-all phrase of gender-based violence and femicide. Femicide is another term that I don't use, and I'll explain that. So I think this catch-all term, I would see it as it is inclusive and the specificity is not there. But once you have your mechanism, then it's about saying to the mechanism, okay, we have this legislation that gives you the mandate to look at where are the gaps in legislation. And if the issue of prostitution, there's a gap and a silence, then you have to ask the council, what are you going to do about it? And that's part of your accountability, right? You're holding the council accountable, asking this question. So that's where I see it coming in. And maybe, because I haven't been part of the process of developing the NSP, maybe this umbrella term includes that understanding, but the specificity is going to come once this council is set up and starts interpreting and implementing its mandate. And that's where, individuals like you, organizations that work on this, because I don't think that there is a denial or an absence of knowledge that whether it's trafficking victims or people who are in the sex work industry, are not being violated. Their rights are being violated. We know that. Their bodies are being violated. We know that. We know there's been cases. I think the Women's Legal Center took up a case. Sweat is doing work. So there have been there has been, I would say, visibility, but maybe not in the way that you are asking about that specificity. And I think that specificity is going to come when this council is set up. And then when you hold them accountable and say, okay, so we've done this review of legislation or policies, here's what we see as missing. And that's where active agents citizenship comes in. It's when we say to the mechanism that we asked for, that we, asked the state to set up, then we ask the question, why is there an invisibility? Why is there silence on this issue? Is it because some people view it as a moral issue? And this issue of morality came in the commission as well when I was a commissioner. When the issue of sex work came up, there were people, I remember one board meeting where some councillors left, the commissioners left the room because they saw this as a moral issue. And, my attitude is, my morality, when I'm in an institution like this, and particularly in a constitutional issue, or if I was sitting as a judge, my morality has to be put outside the door, because this is about a human rights issue. And so I think that's where you come in, Giselda, to once this mechanism is set up and you start asking those harder questions about what has been left, what has been rendered invisible or hasn't been addressed. That's where accountability comes in, where you hold the council accountable. And people who have strong moral positions on things, shouldn't be sitting and judging on human rights issues. So, I mean, you should have a strong moral sense and a moral compass about, equality, non-discrimination, the right of dignity and respect for all, irrespective of the choices that people make about their lives. And sometimes it's choices that are forced upon them. So I hope that answers your question, and I hope you remain active. If you see this as a legal gap, that you bring it up when the council starts at work and you say, okay, how are you going to engage with the South African Law Reform Commission or the Ministry of Justice? There's a normative gap here. It's a legal gap. How are you going to address this issue? And then starts the whole legislative process, which we heard about last week, on how laws are made in the country. Thanks for your question.
Thank you, Prof. Our next question comes from Janet, and she asks, on the question of resource burden, why should CSOs depend on donor funding, and what is the role of public funds? And then the second question is from Managa Pillay from our Facebook. She says, we are constantly swamped with the rhetoric at all levels. How do we move forward? How do we move forward towards the specificity that you talk about? Thank you.
Okay. So hopefully both speakers were listening to me, because I've addressed that. But anyway, the resource burden. I've made it very clear when the previous question came up about saying, look, how do we target donors? And I said, that's not a starting point. Your starting point is the state. The state has a commitment, the state has a responsibility to fund a mechanism such as the council so that it can effectively interpret and implement the tasks that the legislation, the mandate that will be set up. So the starting point for me is your core funding should never be from donors, right? And if you want donor funding, then have certain programmatic activities. And not in the initial foundation stages where you're setting things up. The state needs to fund that advocacy work, the going out and finding out what are the needs, doing the research on where are the legislative gap, as the previous speaker is talking about the issue of prostitution and sex work. So the foundation funding has to be from the state. Special projects, we can approach donors for those things, but we should not be reliant on donors, because this council won't survive. If the state washes its hands off the council, in 2 or 3 years, the council will go the route of the national networks and the provincial networks on violence against women, etc. So my sort of long answer to a short question is the resource burden should not be placed on donors or on civil society to use your existing funds. Yes, we will all come to the party, you know, with if there is an NGO, like I'm sure someone is funding these webinar series. They're probably using their funding that was set aside for something else to do this because it's so important to do this educated work. But it shouldn't become the norm. The norm should be the state takes responsibility and funds it. The rhetoric versus the reality of one more mechanism, I spoke about that right at the beginning, and I know it's going to come up over and over again. I think that this process has moved in a healthy direction because now you have a national strategic plan, right? We did have a national action plan on human rights, and I think after 2 years, we just decided we weren't going to do it. But we have a national strategic plan that is on a specific issue. Now, that means we've taken that step away from the rhetoric. The rhetoric over 18 months, two years, was the marching, the convening of the national summits, the in-your-face activities that were going on. But it did result in something. It resulted in this national strategic plan. It resulted in a national strategic plan that says a council has to be set up, you know, so that the interpretation, implementation can happen. So I do think that there needs to be applause that we have moved a step. We've moved a step from just talking about it and fighting about it and being aggressive about it and saying, you know, we're tired of it, one more woman, one more girl child. So you have the NSP now, and it's our document, and it's about us giving life and not allowing to become rhetoric. And part of it is going back to some of the things that I did say initially that you are going to be stuck with, you know, the sort of political patronage and reward systems. You have to fight against that to make sure that it doesn't go back to being a rhetorical conversation. Political appeasement on issues that disproportionately affect women. You need to bring that up. Perceptions of ownership of the women's agenda. Who owns it? Does the ANC Women's League own it? Does the DA own it? Does the IFP own it? No, we own it. We are the active agents. The minimal understanding of a non-partisan. So it's as if we don't agree with each other, we shouldn't talk to each other. No, that's bullshit, right? We can look at each other. We can be civil. We can talk in respectful ways. And the historical mistrusts and tensions, and I think those exist, and we need to find ways to have those conversations because many of us don't trust the state, right? We've reached that point because of our history and not trusting the state. But we need the state. We don't live in this idealistic world where we can do without the state. We need the state, but we need to be saying to the state, this is not about you giving handouts or charity. This is about you putting your money where your mouth is to set up a strategic, specific mechanism so that in 5 years or 10 years, we can say we don't need it. Because that's where we want. The elimination of violence against women and girls is where we want to be. And I know it seems like idealistic, but all idealistic missions start somewhere. So I think if we hold onto that there will be patronage, there will be rewards. You know, if we can fight those things, then we can move away from the rhetoric. And maybe I'm being idealistic, but I see this, you know, seeing this document, the NSP, and I think that's a step forward because we haven't had in such detail such a document. Maybe the consultation process, the interim committee wasn't as representative, and we're angry at that because it wasn't inclusive, it wasn't representative. We had the usual suspects, as I call them, sitting in these forums. Okay, it's done, right? Are we happy with the NSP? And these webinars have been about informing people about what's in the NSP. And then as you read it and you engage with it and you find the gaps, now you're going to go to the council and you're going to hold them accountable and you're going to say, there is a gap in the NSP. How through a policy, an internal policy, are you going to remedy that gap? You're going to go to the legislature and you're going to say, there is a legislative gap here. How are you going to remedy that? So I think we need, in a sense, to take a step back from our cynicism. And I know it's really hard. Every day on TV, it's making us more and more cynical, the media, the social media, etc. But let's trust our instinct that we moved one step forward by having this on paper. Yes, it was a very difficult process. Yes, it wasn't inclusive. Yes, it wasn't representative. Yes, certain issues are not on the table. But can we look beyond that and say, despite that, I'm going to put my efforts and energy into making sure that this thing works. That's all I can leave you with.
Thank you so much, Prof. Thank you for such a brilliant and an engaging conversation, a brilliant presentation, and I think you have really covered so many areas which we had not yet even thought about. But thank you for that. Thank you for the context. That historical, activism, the rich history of the women's liberation struggle, and the fact that we continuously put our bodies on the line, the robust and fearlessness, speaking truth to power. Thank you so much for going through with the CGE in itself as a body and what we can learn from what its challenges have been in practice institutionally. Thank you for going through with the UN, the special procedures and how we can use those and the lessons that are also learned from those. Thank you so much, Prof. This has really been quite eye-opening and inspiring as well. Thank you to the people who have been asking the questions. Thank you to those who have been here in the webinar. Thank you to those that have been following up on the Facebook chat. Thank you for those that are following up on Twitter as well, and even through the WhatsApp. Thank you for your engagement. Please do continue to engage with us on these various platforms. Please send through your questions. We will be sending a video and a link to this webinar presentation before the end of the day. You should have it within your emails. And also just to note, at the end of this presentation, of this webinar, please don't leave. There is going to be a survey. So we're just going to ask you for a few minutes of your time just to help us also as we continue with the webinars on how we can do better. So please do stay for a few minutes for the survey. Professor, thank you once again. And we look forward to next week's webinar, which is going to be webinar 8, and which is going to be looking also at part 2 of establishing the council. So our question for next week is going to be, what can we learn from the councils? And we're going to look at comparative examples of similar councils. So please do join us again next week, same time, and we look forward to your continuous engagement. We hope that this has been fruitful and a learning experience for you as well, and it is one for us as well. Thank you once again. And
for helping.